The morning David Watkins found a woman standing in the ruins of the Callaway stage stop, her dress torn at the hem and her chin lifted like she dared the Arizona Territory itself to knock her down. He told himself she would be gone by nightfall, and that would be the end of it. He was wrong about that, as it turned out. He was wrong about a great many things where Della Baker was concerned. It was the spring of 1882, and the land around Cobber Creek was the kind of beautiful that could kill you if you were not paying attention. The mesas rose up red and gold against a sky so blue it made your eyes ache, and the scrub brush rolled out in every direction like a sea that had forgotten it was supposed to be water. David had ridden this stretch of territory for 11 years, first as a wrangler for old Harlan Prescott's outfit, then as a hand on the Callaway spread, and finally as the owner of his own modest cattle operation, 140 acres of decent grassland along the creek with a house he had built himself, board by board, over the course of 2 stubborn winters. He did not consider himself a lonely man. He considered himself a man who had learned that certain things cost more than they were worth, and love was at the top of that particular list. He had been engaged once, to a girl named Catherine Hollies from Tucson, and she had followed a railroad surveyor north to Denver before the wedding date arrived, leaving behind a letter that was polite in the way that only truly devastating things can be polite. He had read it twice, folded it carefully, and burned it in the cook stove. Then he had gone out to the south pasture and worked until his hands bled, and his mind was too tired to think about anything at all. That had been 6 years ago, and in the time since, David Watkins had built himself a life that was functional and quiet, and entirely without the kind of hope that could turn around and hurt you. He had his cattle. He had his land. He had a good horse named Biscuit who was 15 years old and still moved like a younger animal, and he had a border collie named Patch who kept the herd in line with a competence that David genuinely admired. He had neighbors he could trust, which was not a thing to take lightly in the territory in 1882, when the Earps were still making headlines, and the cattle wars were fresh enough in people's memories to make everyone a little suspicious of everyone else. He did not have a woman, and he had decided, in the practical way of a man who has stopped expecting things, that he did not need one. All of that calculation came undone on a Tuesday morning in April, when he rounded the bend toward the Callaway stage stop to see about a stray he had spotted the previous evening, and found the place occupied. The stage stop had been abandoned for 3 years, ever since old Pete Callaway had died of a fever, and his sons had sold the land and moved east. The building itself was in reasonable shape, the kind of structure that had been built to last because, in the territory, if it was not built to last, it would not last. The roof had a few gaps where the weather had gotten in, and the front door hung at an angle, but the walls were solid and the chimney still stood straight. What was not supposed to be there was the smoke rising from that chimney, thin and gray against the morning sky. David stopped Biscuit on the ridge and looked down at it for a long moment. Then he checked that his rifle was seated in its scabbard, adjusted his hat, and rode down. She was standing in the doorway when he arrived, and her posture was the posture of a woman who had decided that if something frightening was coming toward her, she was going to face it directly rather than hide. She was somewhere around 24 or 25, he guessed, with dark hair that had come loose from its pins, and was falling around her face in a way that suggested a long and difficult recent history. Her dress was practical gray wool, the kind of dress a working woman wore, and it was dusty and torn at the hem, and one sleeve had been repaired with thread of a slightly different color. Her eyes were brown, the warm, deep brown of good saddle leather, and they were watching him with an intelligence that was immediately apparent and slightly disconcerting. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady. "I hope I have not caused alarm. I will explain if you give me a moment." "This is not your property," David said, which was not perhaps the most gracious opening, but it was accurate. "I know that," she said. "It does not appear to be yours either, but I suspect you know whose it is and can speak for it better than I can. My name is Della Baker. I arrived on the stage from El Paso yesterday evening, and there was an accident approximately 4 miles east of here. The stage turned over in a wash that had more water in it than anyone expected. The driver and the other passenger, a Mr. Whitmore, went ahead on foot to find help. I could not keep up with their pace, and I found this building and stayed the night. I intend to pay for the use of it if I can determine who to pay. David looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the door and the thin smoke from the chimney and back at her. Anyone hurt in the accident? Mr. Whitmore cut his hand on the window frame. The driver seemed uninjured. I bruised my arm considerably. She touched her left arm briefly, and he noticed the way she did not wince, which meant either the bruise was minor or she was the kind of person who did not allow herself to wince in front of strangers. He suspected it was the latter. "The land belongs to a family called Prescott now," David said. "Old Harlan Prescott bought it at auction 2 years ago. He's not the type to charge a woman for shelter in an emergency." He dismounted and looped Biscuit's reins over the hitching post that still stood firm by the door, because whoever had built this stop had used good wood and sunk it deep. "I'm David Watkins. I have a place about 1.5 miles west along the creek." "Mr. Watkins," she said, and she extended her hand in a direct way that most women of the territory did not bother with because most men in the territory did not extend that courtesy to women. He shook it, and her grip was firm. "Where were you headed?" he asked. "Cobber Creek," she said. "I have been hired as the school teacher." He blinked. "The town's been trying to fill that position for 8 months. "Yes," she said, and something crossed her face that might have been mild amusement. "I am aware. The letter I received from the town council made the difficulty quite clear, though it was also clear that they were desperate enough to overlook the fact that I am unmarried and 26 years old and arrived from a city which I gathered were all marks against me." "Where from?" "St. Louis," she said. "Before that, a small town in Missouri called Harker's Mill. I have been teaching for 4 years. I know what I am doing." He believed her. He could not have said precisely why, except that there was a quality to the way she spoke that reminded him of the best of his old trail bosses, the ones who said what they meant and had already thought through the problems before they opened their mouths. "Is there someone in town who knows you're coming?" he asked. "Someone who could send a wagon out?" "A Mrs. Margaret Howell," Della said. "She arranged the boarding situation. She wrote that she had a room above her dry goods store that she lets to respectable women." "I know Margaret," David said. "She's a good woman." He considered the situation, and the consideration took about 4 seconds because it was not actually complicated. He could not leave a woman standing alone in an abandoned stage stop and ride back to his morning work. That was not something he was capable of doing, whatever else might be said about him. "I'll ride into town and let her know what happened. If she can send a wagon, she will. If not, I'll come back with my buckboard and take you in myself." Della Baker looked at him with those steady brown eyes. "I do not want to be a burden." "You're not," he said truthfully. "But I will ask you one thing. Is there anything in that building you've been burning that was not yours to burn?" She looked briefly offended, and then she seemed to understand that he was being practical rather than accusatory, and the offense settled into something more like respect. "I found half a cord of wood stacked against the back wall," she said. "I used 3 pieces and no more. There was nothing else in the building except an old coffee tin and some rope, neither of which I touched." "Good enough," David said. He remounted Biscuit. "Stay here and keep the fire going if you're cold. I'll be back in under 2 hours one way or another." "Mr. Watkins," she said as he turned the horse. He looked back. "Thank you," she said, and she said it like she meant it, which he noticed because he had heard thank you said in a great many ways over the years, and could usually tell the difference between the reflexive kind and the genuine kind. He nodded and rode. Cobber Creek was not a large town, but it was a real one, which counted for something in 1882. It had a proper main street with a general store, a livery, a small hotel, a doctor's office, 2 saloons, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, and the aforementioned dry goods store run by Margaret Howell, who had come out from Ohio 20 years prior with her husband, buried him 2 years after arrival when a horse rolled on him in the creek, and then simply stayed and built something rather than go back east and admit defeat. Margaret was 53 years old, broad-shouldered, and had opinions about nearly everything. When David rode up and told her about Della Baker and the stage accident, she was already untying her apron. 4 miles east, she said, confirming the directions. Give or take, she's at the old Callaway stop. Is she hurt? Bruised arm, she said, otherwise seemed entirely capable. Margaret looked at him with the particular look she reserved for men who were not understanding the gravity of situations involving women. She spent the night alone in an abandoned building in the Arizona Territory, David. That is not nothing. I know that, he said. That's why I'm here. Margaret organized a wagon with the efficiency of a general organizing a campaign, conscripting her nephew Tommy, who was 17 and willing to do anything Margaret told him to, and loading a basket with food and a blanket and a canteen of fresh water. You'll ride back with us, she told David. It was not a question. I was going to, he said. They found Della exactly where David had left her, standing in the doorway, composed and alert. She had, in the time between David's departure and their arrival, managed to pin her hair back up in some approximation of order, which struck David as the kind of thing a person did when they needed to feel in control of something. He understood that impulse perfectly. Margaret climbed down from the wagon seat before Tommy had fully stopped it and covered the distance to Della in about 6 strides, and then the two women were talking in the rapid, layered way that women talked when they were quickly establishing an understanding, and David stayed near the horses and gave them the space to do it. On the ride back to town, Della sat beside Margaret in the wagon seat and David rode alongside. He listened without appearing to listen as Della answered Margaret's questions about her background, her qualifications, her reasons for coming west. She spoke about St. Louis with a kind of careful neutrality that suggested there was a story there she was not ready to tell to a person she had known for 30 minutes. He understood that, too. What he did not expect, and what lodged itself somewhere in his chest in a way he refused to examine, was the moment when the wagon hit a deep rut and lurched badly, and Della grabbed the side rail with her right hand while her bruised left arm swung free, and rather than cry out, she simply tightened her jaw and righted herself and kept talking to Margaret as if nothing had happened. He looked away from her and made himself study the mesa line. That evening, after he had returned to his own property and fed his cattle and eaten a cold supper of beans and salt pork that he had not bothered to heat because heating supper for one man seemed like more effort than it was worth, David Watkins sat on his front porch in the last of the daylight and told himself very firmly that Della Baker was nothing to him. She was a woman passing through the territory on her way to a job. She was someone's school teacher. She was none of his business, and he intended to keep her that way. The firmness of this intention should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt, uncomfortably, like the kind of thing a man says when he is already in trouble. He went to bed and slept badly and was up before dawn to start his morning work, which was how he preferred it, and if he thought about brown eyes and a jaw that tightened against pain and a voice that said thank you like it meant something, he did not acknowledge those thoughts. He had gotten very good at not acknowledging things over the years. Cobber Creek had its schoolhouse on the eastern edge of town, a clean frame building with 4 windows and a bell that still worked. The school board, which consisted of 3 men who had varying levels of interest in children's education and 1 woman, Mrs. Anita Reyes, who had considerable interest in it, had arranged for the building to be cleaned and supplied in anticipation of a teacher who had already turned down the position twice. Della Baker walked into that schoolhouse on a Thursday morning and had 22 children between the ages of 6 and 14 seated and attentive by 9 o'clock, according to multiple accounts that circulated through the town by noon. By the end of her first week, Mrs. Anita Reyes had stopped by the school 3 times to observe, and each time she had come away looking quietly triumphant, in the manner of a person who had been right about something and was pleased to have the proof. David heard all of this because Cobber Creek was a small town and information traveled through it the way water traveled through dry ground, quickly and completely. He heard it from the blacksmith, who had a daughter in Della's class. He heard it from the man who ran the hotel, who had no children but had seen Della buying supplies at the general store and had formed immediate opinions about her competence and character. He heard it from Margaret Howell herself, who had apparently decided that David needed regular updates on the new schoolteacher's progress, despite the fact that he had never asked for any. "She is remarkable," Margaret told him on a Saturday morning when he came in to buy flour and coffee. "She has already identified which children are behind and which are ahead and organized the class accordingly. She has the Henderson boy reading aloud, which his mother said was impossible." "Good," David said, measuring his words carefully in the way of a man who did not want to encourage further conversation on a particular subject. "She has been asking about the families in the area," Margaret continued, with the practiced innocence of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. "She wants to understand the children's home situations. I told her she should speak with you. You have been here longer than almost anyone. You could have told her yourself," David said. "You know everyone." "I know the town," Margaret said. "You know the land. There is a difference." He bought his flour and his coffee and left, and he did not think about Della Baker, and if his route home happened to take him past the schoolhouse, which it would not have done by the most direct path, he did not register that fact with any particular attention. He did not see her that day. He caught a glimpse of her the following Tuesday, outside the school, talking to one of the older boys who appeared to be in some distress about something, and she had her hand on the boy's shoulder and was speaking to him with an intensity and focus that made the boy stop fidgeting and actually listen. David rode past at a respectful distance and did not call out. The occasion that actually brought them into sustained proximity was, of all the undramatic things in the world, a broken fence. It was mid-April, 2.5 weeks after Della had arrived in Cobber Creek, and David was repairing the stretch of his fence line that ran along the north side of his property, the side that abutted the old creek road. It was tedious work, the kind that required attention but not thought, and he had been at it for most of the morning when he heard a horse coming down the road and looked up to see Della Baker riding a bay mare at a careful trot. He had not known she could ride. Most women from the city could not, or could not particularly well. But she sat the horse with a practical ease that suggested genuine experience, and when she noticed him and pulled the mare to a walk, she did it smoothly. "Mr. Watkins," she said. "Miss Baker," he said. "Good afternoon. I was told there is a canyon overlook about 3 miles along this road," she said. "I am trying to learn the geography. I thought it might help me teach it." "There is," he said. "Bear left where the road forks, otherwise you'll end up on the Prescott Range and Harlan's dogs will announce you before you get anywhere near the canyon." "Thank you," she said. She looked at the fence, and then at him, and then at the fence again. "That's a great deal of wire." "Quarter mile of it, give or take," he said. "I imagine that is something one never finishes doing," she said. "Always mending." "That's about right," he said. He straightened up and pushed his hat back because he had been bent over and his neck was stiff. "You getting settled and all right?" "Yes," she said. "Margaret Howell has been very kind. The children are wonderful, which is not something I could say about every school I've taught at." She paused and something moved in her expression. "I owe you a proper thank you for going into town that morning. I had been sitting with that fire trying not to think about the fact that I had no clear plan for what to do next, and then you appeared." "Anyone would have done the same," he said, which was not entirely true, but it was the kind of thing people said. "No," she said simply. "Not anyone. Some people would have told me to move along or question my right to be there or both. You were direct and you were practical and you came back. That is not nothing." He did not know what to say to that. He was not accustomed to being seen that clearly by someone he had spoken to for a combined total of about 20 minutes. "Well," he said, which was not a response of great eloquence. She smiled, and it changed her face in a way that he registered in his chest before he could stop it. "I should let you get back to your mending," she said. "Enjoy your afternoon, Mr. Watkins." "You too," he said. "Miss Baker." She rode on. He watched her go just for a moment and then turned back to his wire and told himself very firmly that this was not a thing that was going to happen to him. He thought about that smile 3 more times before supper, and then refused to think about it at all, which he accomplished with only moderate success. The social life of Cobber Creek in 1882 operated through a series of events that the town had developed over years of practice. There was the church service on Sundays, which not everyone attended, but which served as a social gathering even for those who were uncertain about the theological aspects. There was the monthly town meeting at the church hall, where local matters were discussed with varying degrees of civility. And there was the spring dance, which was held every year on the first Saturday of May, at which the entire territory population within a reasonable radius was expected to appear, whether they wanted to or not. David generally appeared at the spring dance because Margaret Howell expected it, and because he had enough social awareness to know that a man who never appeared at community events eventually became someone the community was not sure about. And in a small territory settlement, being someone the community was not sure about had practical consequences. He arrived at 7 in the evening to find the church hall already lively, the fiddle player and the guitar player in full swing, the long tables along the wall covered with dishes that various women had brought, and the general atmosphere of a community that was glad to have an excuse to forget, for one evening, the difficulty of its daily existence. He was talking to Harlan Prescott about water rights, which was a conversation that could occupy 2 men for a long time if they let it, when he became aware that the quality of attention in the room had shifted in the subtle way it did when something worth noticing had arrived. Della Baker was standing in the doorway with Margaret beside her, looking at the room with the expression of a woman who was perfectly comfortable in most social situations, but was taking a moment to orient herself to this specific one before committing to it. She was wearing a dress that was clearly her good dress, dark blue with a small amount of white at the collar, neat and clean, and sufficiently modest for a schoolteacher in a frontier town. Her hair was up properly, and she had done something with it that suggested care without vanity. She was, David thought, before he could prevent the thought, the most genuinely attractive woman he had seen in a very long time. He went back to talking about water rights. He was on his 2nd cup of the surprisingly good punch that someone had made with dried apple and cinnamon when she appeared beside him, not because she had specifically sought him out, he understood, but because Margaret had steered her in his direction with the practiced subtlety of a woman who enjoyed steering things. "Mr. Watkins," Della said, "how is the fence?" "Finished," he said, "as of yesterday. I imagine it will need mending again by summer." "Almost certainly," he agreed. They stood for a moment watching the dancers. The fiddle player was working through a reel with considerable enthusiasm. "Do you dance?" she asked. "Badly," he said. "Yourself?" "Better than badly," she said, "though frontier dances are somewhat different from what I am accustomed to." "The footwork is the same," he said. "The enthusiasm is just louder here." She laughed, and it was a real laugh, not the careful social laugh of a woman performing pleasantness, but the kind that came from genuine amusement and was slightly surprised at itself. He felt something shift in him, small but significant, like a stone turning over in a riverbed. "Would you like to try?" he asked. He was not sure why he said it, except that he was already saying it before the deciding part of his brain had caught up. She looked at him, those brown eyes calm and direct. "I thought you said you danced badly." "I do," he said. "I was offering as a public service warning." She laughed again and set down her cup and held out her hand, and David Watkins, who had decided 6 years ago that he was finished with the kinds of feelings that made a man stupid, walked out onto the floor with Della Baker and was immediately discovered to be exactly as bad a dancer as he had claimed. She did not seem to mind. She was indeed better than badly, and she had the gift of making her partner look more competent than he was by virtue of her own sense of timing, so that by the second song he was making fewer errors, and by the third he was almost enjoying himself, which was not a sensation he associated with dancing. They danced 3 songs and then stood to the side, and the conversation that developed between them over the next hour was the kind of conversation that neither of them, David thought, had planned on having. It moved from the immediate, the town, the children, the land, to the less immediate, what they had each come from, what they had each expected, and what reality had delivered. She told him about Harker's Mill, about a father who had been a good man with a weakness for whiskey that had eventually displaced the goodness, about a mother who had kept the household together with the kind of quiet determination that does not get sung about in songs. She told him about teaching, about the way it had felt to find something she was genuinely good at, and to know it was also genuinely useful. She told him about St. Louis briefly, and with that careful neutrality he had noticed before. He told her about the territory, about the years on the Prescott Range, about the decision to buy his own land, about biscuit and patch, and the particular satisfaction of a thing you had built yourself with your own hands over 2 stubborn winters. He did not tell her about Catherine Holly's. That was still a door he kept shut. But he told her enough, more than he had told anyone in a long time, and when the evening was over and Margaret was gathering people to head home, David walked Della to Margaret's wagon and tipped his hat, and rode back to his property feeling unsettled in a way he could not immediately name. He lay in bed in the dark of his clean, quiet house and thought, with more honesty than he usually permitted himself, that he was in the early stages of something he had promised himself he would not do again. "Well," he said to the ceiling in the dark, "that is a problem." The problem did not resolve itself. It developed instead with the gradual and irresistible quality of a spring that has found a crack in rock, widening the crack with patience and no particular violence. He began to encounter Della Baker with a regularity that he could not entirely attribute to coincidence, because Cobber Creek was small, and Della was curious about the surrounding country, and often rode out in the evenings after school on the bay mare she had borrowed from the livery owner. Several of those rides took her past his property, and several of those times he happened to be doing something visible from the road, and she would stop, and they would talk. She had opinions about everything, and they were not the mild opinions of a person who formed views in order to seem interesting. They were considered opinions, ones she was also willing to revise when presented with new information, which David respected enormously because he had too much experience with people who treated opinion as identity. She read widely, which was impressive given the limitations of what was available in a frontier town, and she had strong feelings about the treatment of the Apache and Navajo peoples, whose presence in the territory was a constant undertone to everything else, and who were at this moment, in 1882, in the midst of ongoing struggles with the federal government that David had watched play out for years with a growing unease. "The injustice of it is documented and known, and no one in Washington seems to care enough to stop it," she said one evening, sitting on the top fence rail of his north pasture while he worked on a piece of tack that needed mending. "Children removed from families, land treaties broken. I have a student, the eldest Chato boy, whose family came from the reservation, and the things he describes about what his relatives have endured are enough to make you ashamed of the whole enterprise of settlement, no matter how much you believe in the good of it." "I know the Chato family," David said. "They are good people. The father works the raised spread." "He does," she said. "Emilio is one of the brightest children I have. He should have every opportunity." "This isn't a country that always gives every child every opportunity," David said, with the honesty of a man who had watched it long enough to know. "No," she said, "but that is exactly why people like Emilio need teachers who intend to give him everything they have." Her jaw set in the way he was beginning to recognize, the way it had set in the buckboard when she would not wince, and he thought that Emilio Chato was very lucky to have Della Baker for a teacher, and that whatever school she had taught at before was probably somewhat diminished by her departure. There was an evening in early May when they sat on opposite sides of his fence for 2 hours talking about nothing of particular significance, and he realized afterward that it had been the most comfortable 2 hours he could remember in years. Not exciting, not dramatic, simply comfortable, the way a pair of boots is comfortable after it has been broken in, fitting so naturally you stop thinking about it. He did not let himself think too carefully about what that meant. It was Margaret Howell who said it out loud, because Margaret was not a woman who left things to work themselves out when she could assist. "You are falling in love with her," Margaret told him, on a Saturday morning in late May when he came in for his supplies, and she ambushed him before he could reach the flour barrel. "I appreciate your directness, Margaret," he said. "However, you are mistaken." "I have been watching you and watching her for 6 weeks," Margaret said, with the patience of a woman who has marshaled her evidence before presenting it. "You arrive at the dance looking like a man doing his civic duty, and you leave looking like a man who just discovered the day was better than he expected. You mend your south fence line on the same evening she rides out. You have started coming to Sunday service, David, and I have known you for 8 years, and you have not been to Sunday service more than 4 times in those 8 years. The minister has improved," he said. "He has not," Margaret said. "She sits on the 4th pew left side with Anita Ray's." He did not respond to that because there was no response to it that would be useful. "She is a fine woman," Margaret said more gently, "and she is not Catherine Holly's." He felt the familiar tightening in his chest at the name, and then, for the first time in 6 years, it was followed by something else, something that was not quite pain and not quite relief, but was somewhere in between, like land that is thawing after a long winter. "I know she's not," he said. "Then stop acting like she might be," Margaret said, in the same tone she used to tell her nephew Tommy to stop doing something that was going to end badly. He left the store and spent the afternoon being useful in the stubborn, determined way of a man who is trying not to think, and the strategy worked somewhat better than usual, which meant it worked for about 3 hours. That evening he sat on his porch as the sun went down and the mesa turned from gold to red to the deep purple of twilight, and Patch lay at his feet, and he allowed himself, with some difficulty, to be honest. He liked her. He liked her enormously. He liked the way she thought and the way she spoke and the way she held her ground without being rigid, and the way she laughed when something actually struck her as funny, not performed but real. He liked the way she approached the world, as though it were a problem worth solving rather than a verdict she was stuck with. He liked the way she had stood in that doorway with her torn hem and her loose hair and her chin up, daring the territory to try her. He liked her, and he was afraid of what liking her meant, because the last time he had felt this way about someone, it had cost him something he had not fully recovered from, and the recovery he had managed had been built on the principle of not opening himself to that particular cost again. The question, he thought, watching the sky go dark above the mesas, was whether Della Baker was something you chose safety over. He did not think she was. The next time she rode past his property on her evening ride, he did not stay by the fence. He walked out to the road and said, "Would you like to see the canyon overlook? I know the better path to it. The road I pointed you to last month has a bad stretch by the old wash that gets worse in the heat." She looked down at him from the bay mare with those calm brown eyes and said, "Yes, I would like that very much." They rode out together in the long light of the early summer evening, through the scrub and the red rock, up the rising ground to where the land dropped away suddenly and magnificently into a canyon that even David, who had seen it many times, found worth stopping for. She pulled the mare up at the edge and was quiet for a long time, looking at it. The light was doing everything light does best with canyon walls, finding the seams and strata, laying color over color. There was an eagle working a thermal far below, and the only sound was the wind and the distant sound of water. "I understand now why people come here," she said, "and I understand why people stay." "Do you think you will?" he asked. "Stay." She turned and looked at him, and in the last of the warm light her face was very clear. "I thought I came for a year," she said. "That was the initial agreement with the school board, a 1-year contract. And now," she looked back at the canyon, "I think I came for longer than that," she said. "Though I am still working out exactly what that means." He understood that she might not be talking entirely about the school contract, and she understood that he understood, and neither of them said anything more about it, because some conversations are best accomplished in pieces over time, not all at once. On the ride back, the dusk settling around them like a comfort, she told him about the specific joy of teaching a child the moment something clicks, the exact instant when reading becomes not a labor but a capability, when arithmetic becomes not a mystery but a tool. She talked about it with a warmth that was entirely unguarded, and he listened and asked questions that were not polite questions but genuine ones. And by the time they reached the road that forked toward town and toward his property, they had been talking for 2 hours and it had felt like 20 minutes. He pulled Biscuit up at the fork. She pulled the mare up beside him. "Thank you for the better path," she said. "It's there whenever you want it," he said, which was the most he was willing to say, except that his voice said rather more than the words did, and she seemed to hear that. "Good night, David," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and it sounded completely natural as if she had always said it. "Good night, Della," he said. He watched her ride toward town until she was a dark shape against the last light, and then he turned for home, and everything in him was moving in a direction he had spent 6 years trying to stand still. In June, a complication arrived. His name was Garrett Cole, and he was the kind of man the territory produced in some quantity, handsome in a straightforward way, good with horses, employed as a deputy by the county sheriff whose office was in the next town over. He came to Cobber Creek with some regularity on official business, and he began to appear at community events with the kind of timing that could not be entirely accidental, and he was not subtle about the fact that Della Baker was the specific attraction that had improved his opinion of Cobber Creek's social calendar. David saw this happening and told himself it was none of his business. He had made no declarations. He had given no indication to anyone, least of all Della herself, that his feelings were anything other than neighborly. Garrett Cole was a reasonable man with a reasonable life and a face that apparently women found pleasing, and if he was interested in Della, that was between him and her. David told himself this several times over the course of 2 weeks and continued to be miserable about it with a thoroughness that he found annoying. What changed things was an evening at the end of June when there was a gathering at Anita Reyes's house, the kind of informal summer social that was common in the territory, people sitting on porches and in yards in the cool of the evening. David was there because Anita's husband Miguel had asked him about buying a couple of his yearling steers, which was a legitimate business reason. Garrett Cole was there because he was always there now. Della was there because she was becoming central to the social life of Cobber Creek in the way of someone who genuinely likes people and whom people genuinely like back. At some point in the evening, Garrett Cole sat down beside Della and began a conversation that was clearly intended to be charming. He was, objectively, reasonably good at charm. Della was listening to him with the same attentive, evaluating quality she brought to everything, the quality of a person gathering information before forming a conclusion. And then Garrett Cole said something that David could not hear from where he was standing, and Della's face went from attentive to carefully neutral in the way it did when she was managing her response to something she did not like. David was across the yard before he had made any conscious decision to move. He did not do anything dramatic. He appeared beside them and said, "Della, Miguel's wife was looking for you earlier. I think she wanted to show you something inside the house." It was not strictly a lie, because Rosa Reyes had been talking about showing Della the quilt she was working on, and if the timing was extremely convenient, well. Della looked at him with those perceptive eyes, which saw exactly what he was doing, and then she looked at Garrett Cole and said, with a pleasantness that was professionally calibrated, "Excuse me, please." She stood and walked with David toward the house, and when they were far enough away, she said quietly, "He is quite persistent for a man I have spoken to 3 times." "What did he say just now?" David asked. She glanced at him. "He suggested that a woman in my situation, by which he meant unmarried and far from home, might appreciate the security of a man who was established in the territory." "That's a spectacularly poor way to court a woman," David said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." She paused. "He is not the first man to assume that because I am a woman alone I must be looking for the nearest available solution." "You are not a woman who does anything like that," David said, and he said it with such certainty that she stopped walking and looked at him. "No," she said, "I am not." They stood for a moment in the early dark of the summer evening, and the sounds of the gathering came from behind them, and somewhere beyond the Rays' property the creek made its quiet noise, and David Watkins thought, with great clarity and some considerable fear, that this was the moment. "Della," he said. "Yes," she said, and it was not agreement to an unasked question but an indication of attention, though it functioned somewhat as both. "I am not," he said, trying to find the right words, "a man who says things he doesn't mean. I am also not a man who has any recent history of saying things like this, which may mean I am about to say it badly." She was very still. "I would like to call on you," he said, "properly, if you are willing." She was quiet for a moment that was long enough that he felt the beginnings of a particular kind of cold in his chest. "There is something I should tell you," she said, "about St. Louis." "You don't have to," he said. "I think I should," she said, "because if you are going to call on me properly, you should have an accurate account of what you are dealing with." He waited. "In St. Louis," she said, "I was engaged to a man who was a schoolmaster himself, which is perhaps why I believed his assessment of things, because he seemed to understand what mattered to me. He was not a bad man exactly, but he had ideas about what I should do and should not do after we married, and those ideas would have required me to stop teaching. And when I said that I was not willing to do that, he said that he was not willing to marry a woman who valued her occupation above her duties as a wife. She said it plainly, without self-pity, but he could hear the old cut of it under the plainness. I came west partly because the position was offered, and partly because I needed to go somewhere that did not feel like defeat. David looked at her in the blue summer dark. "Teaching 22 children in the Arizona territory does not strike me as defeat," he said. "It strikes me as exactly the right thing for exactly the right person." She exhaled just slightly, just enough that he noticed. "The man in St. Louis would not agree with you." "The man in St. Louis," David said carefully, "is not here." She looked at him for a long moment, and whatever she was evaluating, she came to a conclusion about it. "You should also know," she said, "that I will not stop teaching, not for anyone. I have 140 acres of cattle land and a house I built with my own hands," he said. "I am not in the market for a woman to stay inside it. I am in the market for the specific person who stood in a broken-down doorway with her chin up and her dress torn, and told me she intended to pay for what she had used." She was quiet, and then she said, "You may call on me David Watkins." He called on her. He did it properly, which in 1882 in the Arizona territory meant arriving at Margaret's store with reasonable warning, sitting in the parlor that Margaret provided with pointed generosity, talking in the way of two people who are very interested in each other, and are also aware that the building of real things takes time and cannot be rushed without damage. He learned things about her. He learned that she had taught herself to cook because her mother was often unwell, and someone needed to feed the family, and that she had developed actual skill at it rather than mere competence. He learned that she was not religious in a formal way, but had a quality of reverence for the natural world that expressed itself in the way she noticed things: the light on the mesa, the sound of the creek, the exact way the summer storms built over the mountains and came down the valley. He learned that she was occasionally afraid but was very disciplined about not letting fear direct her, which was a position he recognized because it was his own. She learned things about him. He told her about Biscuit and Patch and the building of the house. He told her about Harlan Prescott and what he had learned from working that old man's land for 8 years before he had enough to buy his own. He told her eventually about Catherine Holly's and about the letter that had been polite in the most devastating possible way and about burning it in the cook stove. I decided, he told her, that it was not worth it, the feeling. And now, she asked. Now I think I was wrong, he said. I think I was protecting myself from something that is actually the point. She reached across the parlor table and put her hand over his, and he turned his palm upward and held her hand. And Margaret Howell, who passed the doorway at that exact moment carrying something completely unnecessary, managed not to smile too visibly. The summer deepened into the long golden heat of July and August, and the courtship deepened with it, moving from the formal to the less formal, from the parlor to the evening rides to the kind of steady daily companionship that does not announce itself, but simply becomes the texture of a life. He stopped at the school sometimes, in the late afternoon when lessons were done, and she would be there still, grading papers or preparing for the next day, and they would talk in the empty schoolhouse with the long light coming through the 4 windows, and Patch would curl up under one of the benches and sleep while they talked. She came to his property one Saturday to see the cattle he was so obviously proud of, and he showed her the herd and explained his breeding program with the enthusiasm of a man who had been thinking about this for years and rarely found anyone who asked the right questions. She asked the right questions. She looked at his bull with the evaluating eye of someone who had been listening and actually processing what she heard. Your south pasture would carry more, she said. The grass looks stronger there. It's better soil, he said. You're right, I've been thinking about expanding in that direction. She looked at him with a small, pleased expression. I know nothing about cattle, she said, but I can read terrain. That's most of it, he said. She saw the house that day as well, the first time she had been inside it, and she moved through it with the respectful attention she brought to everything, looking at the way he had built the shelves, touching the smooth plank of the table he had made himself, standing in the doorway of the kitchen and looking at the well-organized, practical space of it. You built all of this, she said. 2 winters, he said. The first was worse. It's good, she said simply, and he heard in those 2 words exactly what she meant, which was that it was solid and real and made by someone who cared about the result. He made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table and talked for 2 hours, and Patch lay on the floor between them with the peaceful satisfaction of a dog who considers himself an excellent judge of human situations. And when she finally stood to go, David walked her to where the mare was hitched and she looked at him with those clear brown eyes and said, I like your house, David. I'm glad, he said. I like it very much, she said. And there was something in the way she said it the second time that was different from the first, that had in it a kind of imagining, and he stood at the hitching post and watched her ride away and thought that he was going to ask her to marry him. He had already made the decision, he realized. He had made it some time ago and had been waiting for the right moment to catch up with the decision. In September, a less pleasant thing happened. A man named Walter Briggs arrived in Cobber Creek. He was 45 years old, thick in the way of a man who had been muscular in youth and had not remained active, and he wore his authority like a coat he had decided was permanent. He was a representative of a land acquisition company based in Denver, and he was interested in the Creek Valley land, particularly the stretch that included David's property and several of the smaller neighboring operations. He introduced himself around town with the oily pleasantness of a man who has been taught that friendliness is a business tool rather than a quality of character, and he made offers. The offers were framed as opportunities and carried an undertone that was hard to name but easy to feel, the kind of undertone that says this is the good outcome for you, the alternative being left unspecified. David's neighbors, the Garza family who had 60 acres on the south side of the creek, and old Sam Wheeler who had a small horse operation on the east, came to David separately on the same week to tell him about the visits they had received and the feeling those visits had left. He said the company would prefer to work with us, Maria Garza told him, sitting in his kitchen, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. He said it in a way that made me feel that not working with them was something I should think carefully about. He said the same thing to me, Sam Wheeler said, leaning against David's fence. Almost the same words. Said he admired what I'd built here, but that the territory was changing and men in my position ought to consider their futures. David had his own encounter with Briggs on a Thursday morning, when the man rode up the creek road and stopped at his fence line and made his offer in the same carefully pleasant language, and with the same undertow of something that was not quite a threat but was adjacent to it. David listened to all of it without interrupting, which Briggs seemed to interpret as receptiveness. "I will think about it," David said when Briggs was done. "Don't take too long," Briggs said pleasantly. "These opportunities don't remain open indefinitely." "I'll bear that in mind," David said. Briggs tipped his hat and rode away, and David went inside and sat at his kitchen table and thought, with the methodical attention of a man who does not panic but takes problems seriously, about what he was dealing with. He talked to Della about it that evening. He had discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that she was the person he wanted to talk to about problems, not because he needed her to solve them, but because her thinking about things was genuinely useful, and because there was a relief in not carrying things alone that he had not let himself experience in a long time. "He is working through the valley systematically," she said, sitting across from him at the table, because by now she came to the house on Saturdays with some regularity and they had stopped treating it as a formal occasion. "If he can acquire 2 or 3 properties, the ones that remain become isolated and then the pressure on those increases." "That's how I read it," David said. "You should talk to Harlan Prescott," she said. "He is the largest landowner in the area." If Prescott is not interested in selling, Briggs's position is significantly weaker. "Prescott won't sell," David said. "He built his whole life on that land." "But you're right that talking to him formally and getting the neighbors together makes the position clearer. There is also the question of what company Briggs is representing and what their legal standing actually is," she said. "A letter to the county seat asking about registered land acquisition operations might be very informative." He looked at her across the table. "You are very good at this," he said. "I am very good at problems," she said. "They are like lessons. You identify what you know, what you do not know, and what you need to find out." He wrote the letter to the county seat. He organized a meeting at the church hall, which 11 landowners attended, and which resulted in a collective agreement not to sell and to document any pressure tactics for potential legal complaint. Harlan Prescott, as predicted, was immovable and cheerfully contemptuous of anyone who thought otherwise. Briggs made one more appearance in Cobber Creek in October, and the reception he received was sufficiently unified and cool that he left with the unambiguous message that this particular valley was not as available as he had assumed, and did not return. After it was resolved, David rode over to the Garza property, and then to Sam Wheeler's place to tell them the situation was settled, and both times they thanked him and he said that the credit belonged equally to everyone, which was true, and to Della Baker, which they noted with expressions that were knowing and warm. October in the territory was the best month of the year, the heat gone and the sky an impossible clear blue, and the cottonwoods along the creek going gold in a way that was so beautiful it sometimes made David feel that the beauty was a kind of argument, that the land itself was making a case for its own worthwhileness. He had chosen the ring in September, at the jeweler's shop in the next town, a simple thing with a small stone, because he knew Della Baker was not a woman who wanted elaborate decoration, but who would appreciate something that was well-made and genuine. He had kept it in the drawer of his bedside table for 6 weeks, waiting for the right moment, and he was beginning to understand that there was not going to be a perfect moment, that the perfect moment was something people invented in retrospect, and that what there was in the present was an ordinary golden afternoon in October, and the woman he loved sitting on the bench outside his front door watching the creek while Patch dozed at her feet and Biscuit stood in the near pasture in the warm sun. He came outside with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her on the bench, and they were quiet for a while in the way they were sometimes quiet together, comfortably, without it meaning anything was wrong. "Della," he said. "David," she said, looking at the creek. "I have something in my pocket," he said. She turned and looked at him, and he saw that she already understood, or was beginning to, because she was very perceptive and she had been watching him for several months and she knew him well by now. He put his hand in his pocket and brought out the ring and held it where she could see it, and the afternoon light caught the small stone. "I am not a man who talks beautifully," he said. "But I want to try to say this correctly. I have spent 6 years building a life that was completely adequate and completely without the thing that made it mean something. And then you were standing in a doorway in a torn dress telling me you intended to pay for what you had used, and I spent the next 6 months arguing with myself about what I was feeling and losing that argument badly." He paused. "I would like to spend the rest of my life on this land with you. I would like you to keep teaching for as long as teaching is what you want to do. I would like to keep building this together. I am asking you to marry me, and I want you to know that I mean every word of it." She looked at him for a moment that was long enough that he felt the familiar cold, and then she reached out and put her hand over his, the hand that was holding the ring, and closed his fingers gently around it for a moment before opening them again. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, David Watkins." He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it, and then she looked at him, and they sat for a long time on the bench in the October afternoon, while the creek moved and the cottonwoods shed their gold leaves and Patch snored at their feet, and he thought that this was what the word home actually meant. They were married in November, in the church that David had started attending regularly, because she sat on the 4th pew left side, with the whole of Cobber Creek present and Margaret Howell in the front row looking quietly triumphant in the way of a person who has been right about something important and is satisfied by the proof. Anita Rays arranged the flowers, which were dried autumn blooms because it was November, and they were beautiful in the plain November church. The minister, who had perhaps improved after all, spoke simply and genuinely, and David and Della stood before him and said the words that had been said in this country for a long time, words about staying and honoring and keeping. Della's dress was ivory wool, practical and clean-lined, chosen by a woman who knew what suited her and was not interested in performance. She was, David thought, standing beside him in the plain November light, the most genuinely beautiful woman in the world, in the specific way that has nothing to do with arrangement of features and everything to do with the coherence of a person, the sense that what is inside and what is outside have reached some agreement with each other. He said "I do," and meant it with every part of himself that was capable of meaning anything. She said "I do," and looked at him with those steady brown eyes, and everything in them was clear. The whole town ate and drank and danced in the church hall afterward, and the fiddle player worked until his bow arm was tired, and David danced with his wife, still badly, and she still made him look better than he was, and he thought this was probably going to be the pattern of their life, and he was entirely content with it. That night, in the house he had built himself over 2 stubborn winters, with the fire burning low and the territory dark and quiet outside, David Watkins lay awake next to Della and thought about what it meant to have been wrong about something important, and to have been corrected by the exact right circumstances at the exact right time. He had not believed in love. Not as a practical matter, not as something that held up under the actual conditions of actual life. He had believed in it as a theory that some people managed to make work, and he had removed himself from that category after Catherine Holly's and her polite letter, and he had built his adequate life on the principle of sufficiency rather than abundance. He looked at the dark ceiling of the bedroom and listened to Della breathe, and everything that 6 years of adequate had cost him was clear to him in that moment, and also worth it, because it had brought him exactly here. In the morning, he woke at his usual hour before dawn, the habit of years, and rose quietly in order not to wake her. He dressed in the dark and was reaching for his hat when he heard movement in the kitchen, and he stopped. He walked down the short hall to the kitchen doorway and stood there. Della was at the stove. She had been awake before him, or had risen moments after, he did not know which. She had put on her house dress and pulled her hair back loosely, the way it sometimes looked when she had not given it her full attention, and she had the fire going in the cook stove, which she had clearly navigated by feel in the early dark because she had figured out, sometime in the preceding weeks during her Saturday visits, the particular way his stove damper operated. She had found, without any direction, the skillet that hung on the left wall peg. She had found, without any searching that appeared uncertain, the tin of lard on the second shelf. She was making breakfast, bacon and eggs from the eggs his neighbor's chickens had provided the prior day, and the coffee was already on and beginning to smell like coffee, and she moved around the kitchen with the ease of a woman in a space she knew. She had not been in his kitchen alone before, but she moved like she had always been there, like the kitchen had been waiting for exactly her specific navigation of it, like she had measured the distance from the stove to the shelf 1,000 times, and had the layout in her body the way people have places they belong in their bodies. He stood in the doorway and watched her, and something happened to him that was beyond words, though he was going to try to find words for it later, and was going to fail somewhat in the way that anyone fails when they try to describe the thing that is actually too large for the specific vessel of language. She had not asked where anything was. She had not hesitated. She had walked into his kitchen and cooked breakfast as if she had always lived here, because, in some way that he was only beginning to understand, she had. Not in the literal sense, in the other sense, in the sense that some people are already so much a part of a place that the place has been waiting for them without knowing to name the waiting. He must have made a sound, or she had heard him in the way you hear the person you are paying attention to even when you are not looking at them, because she turned from the stove and looked at him in the early light. "You were quiet," she said. "I was going to have it ready before you woke." "I always wake early," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. She looked at him for a moment with those perceptive eyes, and she saw whatever was in his face, and she turned back to the stove without making anything of it, because she understood that some things should be allowed to be felt without being immediately discussed. "Sit down," she said. "The coffee is almost ready." He sat at the kitchen table and watched her finish cooking and watched her pour his coffee and set it in front of him and sit across from him with her own cup, and she had put the food on the table between them, bacon and eggs, simple and hot and exactly right, and she looked at him and said simply, "Good morning." "Good morning," he said. He picked up his fork and looked at her across the breakfast table in the early light of their first morning, and he thought, with a fullness that had no room left in it for the 6 years of adequate, that he had been wrong. He had been profoundly, completely, entirely wrong about love, and he was so glad to have been wrong that the gladness was almost too large to contain. "You found everything," he said. "The kitchen makes sense," she said. "You put things where they belong. It's logical." "You moved the coffee tin," he said. He had noticed it, moved from the right of the stove to the left. "The left side is closer to where you stand when you pour," she said, without apology, in the way of a woman who has considered the arrangement of a kitchen and formed a view about it. He laughed. He laughed the way he had not laughed in years, from somewhere genuine and deep, and she looked at him with a smile that was not surprised exactly but was pleased, the smile of someone who had wanted to give a person a gift and had gotten the giving right. "All right," he said. "The coffee tin stays on the left." Winter came down from the mountains in December, the territory cold and blue and still in its winter way, and the life that David and Della were building shaped itself around the season. She continued teaching, because that had never been in question, riding the mare into town each morning bundled against the cold, and coming home in the early dark with papers to grade and stories about the children that she told at the supper table, while he listened with the genuine interest of a man who has discovered that other people's days are not a burden to hear about when you care about the person telling them. Emilio Chato won the school board's reading prize that December, the first student from a non-Anglo family to do so, and Della came home from the ceremony with her eyes bright and her voice full of the kind of satisfaction that is different from regular satisfaction, the satisfaction of having done something that costs more than nothing and matters more than a lot. His mother was there, she said. She cried, not unhappily, the good kind. You did that, David said. Emilio did that, Della corrected him. I only made the room large enough for it. He looked at her across the supper table and thought that making the room large enough for things was, in fact, exactly what she had done for him. And he did not say this because he was still somewhat limited in his ability to express that kind of thing out loud, but he thought it with great clarity. She was learning the cattle work, not because she needed to know it, but because she was interested, and because she had found that understanding the land she lived on was important to her. She learned to read the south pasture's grass, and to tell when the water table was dropping by the behavior of the herd near the creek. She learned Biscuit's moods, which were consistent and readable, and Patch's working signals, which were subtle and very efficient. She and Patch developed a relationship of mutual respect that David found entirely charming, because the dog was selective about people and had made his selection rapidly and without ambiguity. In the spring, David bought the adjacent 40 acres that had been sitting empty since the Briggs affair had blown over, which brought his land to 180 acres and gave him the south pasture expansion he had been thinking about. He and Della walked the new land together on a Sunday afternoon, through the new grass and the early spring flowers that dotted the Arizona flats, and she asked the right questions, and he answered them, and they made plans the way people make plans when they are confident in their direction. Margaret Howell noticed, at some point in February, that Della was coming into the store less than usual for certain items, and asked, with the directness that was her primary social characteristic, whether there was news. There was news. Della was expecting a child, which she and David had known since January and had kept to themselves with the privacy of people who are still in the early stages of letting themselves trust a good thing. The pregnancy was healthy, and Della was typically practical about it, continuing to teach through the spring and into early summer with the approval of the school board, which had discovered by now that Della Baker Watkins was too valuable to lose to conventions that she found unreasonable. She was tired in the evenings and sometimes queasy in the mornings, and she was magnificently unwilling to make more of either of these facts than was warranted. David made adjustments to the house. He built a second room off the back of the kitchen, a proper room with good windows, where the child would sleep, and he built it with the same stubborn attention he had brought to every board of the original house. Della helped him design it, making suggestions about the window placement and the storage that were better than what he had planned, and he incorporated them and did not pretend otherwise, because she was right, and being right was more important than being the one who thought of it. The child arrived in October, a boy, who arrived after a labor that was long and difficult, and during which David spent 10 hours in alternating states of prayer and helpless activity, doing whatever the midwife, a capable woman named Rosa who had delivered most of the children in the Creek Valley, told him to do, which was mostly to be useful and stay out of the way. When Rosa put the child in David's arms, he stood in the bedroom of the house he had built and held his son, who was red and furious about the general situation of having been born, and he felt something that he had no framework for at all, which was appropriate because it was entirely new. He looks angry, he said. He is, Della said, exhausted and beautiful in the way of women who have just done something enormous. He will settle. What do we call him? They had been going back and forth about names for months. She looked at her son and then at her husband with her steady brown eyes. "William," she said, "for your father, if that is still what you want." "It is," David said. "William James Watkins." William James Watkins settled, as predicted, within his first week, and became a serious and observant infant who watched the world with a focus that his father recognized immediately. The look of a person who is gathering information and will form a view about it. Della went back to teaching in the spring, because that had always been the plan, and William went with her in the early months in a basket that sat behind her desk while she taught 23 children, because Margaret Howell had sent a full year's worth of the Callaway land's previous owner's progeny to Cobber Creek, and the school was larger. The town took William's presence in the classroom as an entirely natural thing, partly because Della had managed it so competently that there was no clear argument against it, and partly because William, for his part, seemed to find the sounds of a classroom instructive and did not complain about them. David brought her lunch on Tuesdays, riding into town with a packed meal, and sitting on the school steps for 20 minutes while Della ate and William slept in the crook of her arm and the children ran in the yard. These Tuesday lunches became, over time, one of the things the whole town knew about, the way small towns accumulate the habits of their people into a kind of communal knowledge about what a life looks like. Sam Wheeler told him once simply, "You are a happy man, David." "Yes," David said. "I am. It suits you," Sam said. "Some men it would look wrong on, you it looks right." Biscuit died in the fall of William's first year, quietly in the night, in the way of very old horses who have lived fully and simply are done. David found him in the morning and stood with him for a while, his hand on the old horse's neck, and felt the appropriate grief for something good that has had its full time. He buried him in the south pasture because that had been the old horse's favorite ground, and Patch lay nearby while he worked, and then went and sniffed the turned earth with a solemnity that seemed to indicate understanding. He got a new horse, a young chestnut gelding he called Cooper, who was energetic and opinionated and needed several months to decide that David was someone worth listening to. Della liked Cooper immediately and rode him on Sundays, which was fine because Cooper, whatever his opinions about being ridden by David, had apparently decided that Della was self-evidently competent and could do as she liked. William turned 2 in October and began to talk with the same direct, evaluating quality that his mother had in speech, forming short but specific sentences about what he observed and what he wanted and what he thought about things. He called Patch by name with a precision that seemed to please the dog, who followed the child at a careful distance whenever he was outside, as if this were a herding duty and he took it seriously. Della found in the second winter that she was expecting again, and this time they told Margaret first, who was clearly gratified by being trusted with this information, and managed not to tell everyone in Cobber Creek for almost 3 days, which was remarkable restraint. The second child, born in the early summer, was a girl, Clara Mee, who arrived with considerably less drama than William had, and immediately demonstrated that she had no particular interest in being angry about the situation. She was placid and golden and examined the world with an expression of benign curiosity that made everyone who saw her feel that the world was probably going to be all right. "She looks pleased about everything," David said. "She was comfortable before," Della said. "She is comfortable now. She is not a person who makes unnecessary complications." "She gets that from her mother," David said. "She gets that from a sensible arrangement of her own temperament," Della said, and he laughed. Margaret Howell stood godmother to both children, which was an office she took seriously and exercised with great warmth, and which gave her sufficient reason to be present at the Watkins property on a regular basis that she eventually stopped requiring a reason and simply came when she felt like it, which was several times a week, and which neither David nor Della objected to because Margaret was genuinely useful and genuinely beloved. The school grew. In 1885, the school board, which had by now fully internalized the truth that they had gotten very lucky with Della Baker Watkins, agreed to fund a second teacher and a modest expansion of the building. Della helped choose the new teacher, a young woman from New Mexico named Patricia Solis, who had grown up speaking both Spanish and English, and whose ability to communicate with the Spanish-speaking families in the area dramatically expanded the reach of the school. Emilio Chato, who was 14 now, was one of the student tutors who helped Patricia learn the specific rhythms of the Cobber Creek student body, because Della had a gift for understanding which students had more to give and giving them the room to give it. David expanded the herd in 1885 and 1886, working with Miguel Reyes on a joint grazing arrangement that benefited both operations and demonstrated the particular truth that cooperation in the territory, when it was genuine, was worth more than competition. He hired two hands, brothers named Earl and Pete Donahue, who were hardworking and honest, and who made Patch's life easier by understanding that the dog was not decorative. The house grew too. They added a front room in the spring of 1885, a proper sitting room with shelves that David built to Della's specifications for the books that had accumulated over 3 years of a woman who read, and a man who was learning to read more than he had before, because she left books where he would find them and found ways to make the finding seem casual rather than deliberate. He read them. Some of them he had opinions about, which he told her, and she had opinions back, and the conversations that resulted were among the best he had ever had. She taught him to read more slowly, which was a gift. He had been a fast, practical reader, functional, getting the information and moving on. She showed him how to sit with a thing, how to let it do what it was trying to do. It was, he thought, not entirely unlike the lesson of the territory itself, which rewarded the people who paid attention to it and overwhelmed the people who were in a hurry. Garrett Cole married a woman from the next county in 1884, a cheerful red-haired woman named Fern who ran the town's small laundry and who made Garrett significantly happier than he had any other visible means of achieving. David ran into him occasionally, and they were perfectly cordial, because there was nothing between them that warranted anything else. The injustices of the territory continued to be felt. In 1886, the Geronimo campaign reached its final stages, and the stories that came through Cobber Creek from the south and east were stories of displacement and suffering that Della discussed with her students, including Emilio Chato, with the honesty and care that difficult things required. She did not pretend the world was simpler than it was, but she also did not leave her students without the sense that what they did in their own lives, how they treated one another, what they built in their own community, was a response to the world's failures rather than a surrender to them. Emilio Chato, at 15, was the best student the Cobber Creek School had produced in its short history. Della had written twice to a secondary school in Tucson on his behalf. The second letter, in the fall of 1886, received a reply that made Della come home from school that evening and announce to David, before she had even removed her coat, that Emilio had been offered a place. David looked at her face, which was alight with a quality he recognized as the kind of joy that comes from something mattering, something real and lasting, and he crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, coat and all, and held her. "You did that," he said. "We did that," she said. "This whole town." Margaret and Anita and the Chato family, who brought him here and kept him here, and you, David, because you made the kind of place where that could happen. He thought about this, standing in his kitchen with his wife in his arms and the children's voices from the next room and the smell of supper on the stove, and he thought that she was right, that a place was built by all of the decisions that were made in it, and that the decision to stay and to treat the staying seriously was perhaps the most important one. William was 5 in October of 1886, tall for his age and grave, and relentlessly curious about the cattle and the land and the way things worked. He followed David around the property on weekend mornings with the focused attention of a person who is learning something important and knows it. Clara was 3 and followed William with the focused attention of a person who has decided that her brother is the most interesting subject available, which was probably true. On a Saturday morning in November, David came in from the early feeding to find Della at the stove in the kitchen, the children still asleep, the fire going, the coffee already made. She was making breakfast for the 3 of them who were awake, moving around the kitchen with the ease of someone in a space they have inhabited fully and made their own. He stood in the doorway and watched her. She heard him and looked over her shoulder. "You are staring again," she said. "I am," he agreed, not moving. She turned back to the stove. "The coffee is ready." He crossed the kitchen and poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter and watched her work and felt with the same fullness that had no room left in it for anything other than what it was, the precise reality of the life he was standing in. "Della," he said. She was focused on the skillet. "I need to tell you something." "Tell me," she said, still focused. "I thought for a long time that love was something that cost more than it gave," he said. "I thought the accounting never came out right. I thought the only intelligent position was not to invest." She turned from the stove and looked at him. "I was wrong about everything," he said. "I was wrong about all of it." She looked at him for a moment with her steady brown eyes, and in them was everything they had built together. The house and the land and the children and the Tuesday lunches and the canyon overlook, and the October afternoon on the bench and the morning she had walked into his kitchen and cooked breakfast as if she had always lived there, because in the way that mattered she had. "I know," she said simply. And then she smiled, that real smile that was slightly surprised at itself even now, all these years later. "I needed you to be wrong. I was counting on it." He set down his cup and crossed the kitchen and kissed her, and she let the skillet look after itself for a moment. And from down the hall came the sound of small feet hitting the floor, which meant William was awake and Clara would be in approximately 30 seconds, and the morning was becoming itself in the way of mornings that are full of the right things. He pulled back and looked at her face in the morning light of their kitchen. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning, David," she said. Clara's voice lifted from the bedroom, the bright, inquiring sound of a 3-year-old who has things she needs to know. William's voice answered her, the patient older sibling voice of a 5-year-old who has decided it is his responsibility to explain things. Della turned back to the stove with a laugh. He sat at the kitchen table and watched her finish making breakfast, and the children came in and the table filled, and the morning opened up around them all like the canyon opened in the long light, wide and deep, and full of the specific, irreplaceable color of the life that they had built here on 180 acres along Cobber Creek in the Arizona Territory, in the years when the world was still making itself, and the best response to that was to make something good and true and lasting, and to keep mending it when the weather got in, and to know that the mending was not the failure but the practice of love, which was the thing he had been wrong about, gloriously and permanently. Wrong, and which he would spend the rest of his life being grateful for. The cottonwoods along the creek went gold every October and shed their leaves and came back every spring, and the south pasture grew stronger every year with the better drainage David had put in. And Patricia Solis became one of the best teachers in the county, and Emilio Chato came back from Tucson as a young man with a qualification and a future and a depth in his eyes that said he understood exactly who had made the room large enough for him. And William at 10 could read the south pasture as well as his father, and Clara at 8 was already showing signs of her mother's capacity for the kind of thinking that solved problems before they became crises. Patch died at 12, which was a long life for a working dog, and was buried beside Biscuit in the south pasture, and a new dog arrived, a young border collie named Scout who needed months to learn the herd's habits, and who William took it upon himself to train with a patience that made David watch his son and understand something about what it meant to be a father, which was that you did not know, when you started, that you were going to produce a person who astonished you. Margaret Howell, at 63, was as present and opinionated as ever and showed no signs of altering this condition. She had in recent years taken to telling people that she had known David Watkins would be a happy man from the moment Della Baker had arrived in the territory, which was a revision of history so extreme that David had pointed it out to her directly, and she had waved it off with the serene confidence of a woman who has decided that the story she is telling is better than the one that actually happened, and who may not be entirely wrong. One evening in October, when William was 12 and Clara was 10, the four of them sat on the front porch of the house in the last of the day's warmth, the sky doing everything it did best over the mesa, and Clara was asking David about the canyon, because she had heard the story of the first ride there and wanted to hear it again. "Tell it from the beginning," she said. "The whole thing." David looked at Della, who was looking at the mesa with the expression she had for the natural world, that quality of reverence that was entirely her own. "The beginning," he said, "was a stage accident 4 miles east of here, and your mother standing in a doorway with her chin up." "I know that part," Clara said. "Then what do you want to know?" he asked. Clara thought about this. "When did you know," she asked, "that you wanted to marry her?" William looked up from the book he had been pretending to read. He was also interested in the answer to this, David could tell, but was 12 and therefore maintaining a posture of indifference. David looked at the mesa and thought about the question honestly, in the way he tried to think about things. "I think I knew fairly early," he said. "But I did not let myself know that I knew, which is different." "Why not?" Clara asked. "Because I was afraid," he said. "And because I thought I knew better than to fall in love, and I was wrong." "What changed your mind?" Clara asked. David looked at Della. Della looked at him, those brown eyes that had been looking at him for years now and still made something happen in his chest. Not the same thing as in the beginning, something larger and quieter and more like solid ground than fire, though the fire had not entirely gone away either. "Your mother," he said, "walked into my kitchen one morning and made breakfast like she had always lived there." He paused. "And I understood that there are some things you cannot argue with." Clara looked between her parents with the evaluating attention of a 10-year-old who is deciding what she thinks about this. Then she said, "That is a good story." "Yes," David said, and he was looking at Della when he said it. "It is." Della reached over and put her hand on his, on the arm of the porch bench where they had been sitting for years now, in the October evenings when the territory was at its most beautiful, and he turned his palm upward and held her hand, the ring he had put on her finger in a different October still there, worn smooth with years, still exactly right. The sky went from gold to red to the deep and final blue of evening, and the creek made its quiet sound, and the children's voices continued on the porch. And the life that David and Della Watkins had built on 180 acres in Cobber Creek held everything it was supposed to hold, everything it had been built for, and it was more than enough. It was the right kind of everything, and it was going to keep.